there's quite a vain king who changes his clothes every hour of the day because he likes his appearance. And a couple of rogues come into town, and they say that they will be weavers of the finest imaginable cloth to prepare a suit of clothes fit only for an emperor. And the emperor is very taken with the idea, and they get to work with this weaving exercise. They demand all the finest silks and other dyes, and all this material is delivered to them, which they quietly put in their bag as they're weaving away an imaginary set of clothes. The added dimension that I'd not appreciated till now was they said that anyone who is unworthy to serve the king will be unable to see this material. They just won't have the qualities required. So a couple of courtiers are sent to see how they're getting on with the new clothes, and they admire the wonderful colours and patterns and textures, because, you know, they're a bit fearful that if they say they can't see anything, that'll be the end of their jobs, because they're clearly not worthy. And then the king himself goes for a fitting, and they go through all the motions, and he looks down and can't see anything either. And he says, oh God, does that mean I'm not fit to be king? So everyone carries on with this joke until the kid in the street, when they're walking round, says, hey, that man's got no clothes on. So it's actually quite a subtle and intricate tale. Anyway, that's just an aside. I guess we use the word in a number of, or the phrase in a number of ways these days, and sometimes it's someone taking a position with no evidence to support them. So nakedness isn't terribly elegant often after the age of 20 or so, and I guess so I'll be talking about the usual suspects here. Fascinating stuff about buprenorphine that's just been published, new roles for it, and maybe some hope for the beginning of the end of the war on drugs. You never know. So one thing that attracted me to this, it's really a book, it's huge, several hundred pages, by Simon Chapman, who's a bit of a hero, I think. Australia and tobacco plain packaging, removing the emperor's clothes. And Mike Daub, who's over in WA, very staunch smoking cessation fellow, he writes the introduction, and for those who can't get through the whole book, the introduction is excellent. At its simplest, the story is one of public good against commercial evil. One of those great oppositions. While most of the industry's claims have been discredited, remember the industry was saying that it would fail, and they tried to claim that sales of tobacco had increased since the plain packaging came into law. Its greatest concern, the domino effect, i.e. that other countries would take it on, has been justified. So that's really rather nicely summarised, I think. And then he goes on to draw 6 conclusions about this exercise. Big tobacco can be defeated, political leadership can trump cynical commercial interests. Doesn't always, of course. It can, yes, thanks very much. And this was written long before the election, so I don't know what you should draw in the way of conclusions there. And this is a fascinating, number 3, big tobacco is on the nose. Because it's generally so badly regarded, the quality of their executives is really of a low calibre. So they don't make good decisions, and that makes them all the easier to beat up and lose out. Public health coalitions can be effective. Sound research and strong evidence, that's what we need to underpin public health and advocacy for change. And this battle is part of a war, if we need to use this analogy, which began 64 years ago. So in the UK we had Don Peter, and in the US Winder and Graham, showing the long-term health effects of smoking. Now, I put this slide in long before, but you know, we were so saturated, and I did it because it mentions here the emperor's new border, not clothes, but I think this is Mexico, America. And one loves this noun, Trumpiness, after truthiness, and this is Stephen Colbert, who has a late night humour show. I don't watch it, but apparently it's very popular. What you feel in your abdomen, this is truthiness, which is this kind of sense that something should be right, backed by no evidence, but that kind of intuition which we all have. So Trumpiness is like that feeling in the gut, except much lower down. Okay, so slaying the dragon. This is back to tobacco again. So now the UK, after Australia and Ireland, has embraced PPL, as we like to abbreviate things. Remember, BAT, British American Tobacco, now says it's a harm reduction industry. Go figure how that can possibly be. We know how important language is, though, don't we? Unfortunately, smokers around the world, particularly in the developing world or the South, continue to increase in numbers. And we've seen tobacco companies buying up electronic nicotine delivery system manufacturers in a major way. So they're really seeing this as a key to their future. And what that means for e-cigarettes, perhaps we can discuss in a moment. So what we've seen in Australia is heavy discounting, increase in brand variety. Even though we've got plain packaging, there's now many more brands, more cut price deals, particularly on twin packs. So that's the way to get the cheapest cigarette, so buying more for less. Colour is now included in 80% of brand names, whereas before PPL it was less than 50%. And of course, by colour you can imply a safer product. So white or gold is safer than red or black, it seems, in that sort of subconscious way we make decisions sometimes. And so that messaging has been taken up by the companies to try and maintain their market share. Of course, that's really hard to read, isn't it? But inside the supposed constituents of e-cigarettes are listed glycerol, propylene glycol and nicotine. However, there's a range of other chemicals, some of which are quite harmful, and in the aerosols that are delivered to the lungs, we have things like formaldehyde, which is a carcinogen. So this is just a map from New England recently about how the cigarette works, and one of the problems is this heating coil, which is made of metal, and slowly over time it degrades, releasing potentially heavy toxic metals into that aerosol, into those lungs. So while there was a report in the UK saying that e-cigarettes are 95% or 99% safer than cigarettes as a whole, that sparked absolute outrage because we haven't got enough long-term data following up people using e-cigarettes. One thing that I hadn't really considered until this paper and another one is the risk of injury from explosion. So these rather gory photos show users who've either had the e-cigarette in their pocket or they've had it actually applied to their lips and the thing has caught fire, exploded in front of them. And there was a number of cases. So this is essentially a case report, but following this there was a letter from another group in their burn centre. They had seen 10 cases in 6 months of severe burns, and there's no warning of that risk on the devices. So that's another thing to kind of put in the scales when we're considering risk-benefit, is it not? Now, this is from a very large study with Robert West, who's editor of Addiction, and he's a very prominent psychological smoking cessation expert. So they looked at data they collect in the UK, which includes more than 8 million quit dates that patients have set for themselves. And what you could see on this graph, and just to make it more straightforward, this dotted brown line is successful quit attempts. So if you kind of look at the graph, it is slowly going up. What we can see is the number of quit attempts is going down, and the use of e-cigarettes is going up. As is the use of e-cigarettes during a quit attempt. So the point they're trying to make is, although overall there may be fewer people trying to quit, the number who actually do using e-cigarettes has gone up significantly, and the ones that succeed seems to have gone up as well. This is another very complicated set of graphs, but on each of the 4 graphs we've got electronic cigarette use during a quit attempt, so that simplifies things. Here it is against prescriptions for NRT, so they're going down while e-cigarettes are going up. And bear in mind, this is in the UK where there's little or no regulation of e-cigarettes. So I was there about 2 years ago, and I was shocked to see in supermarkets or mouths there were e-cigarette stands with scantily clad young ladies being pictured, etc., making it look like a really sexy thing to do. So here we have over-the-counter sales of NRT and the e-cigarettes. So these are going down, those are going up. Here we have prescribed NRT, that also is going down, and stop smoking services, so contacting Quitline and stuff, that's going down. So in a sense, what looks to be happening in the UK is a really dramatic take-up of e-cigs, a reduction of use of conventional quitting support and treatments, and a gradual, a slow increase in the number who are succeeding in quitting. So that maybe presents a slightly optimistic view. However, I think we should always think about kids, and if we can stop kids taking up smoking, that's going to be 3/4 of the task done, isn't it? So this is a paper from JAMA just this month, the association of vaping, as they call it over there, and progression to heavier patterns of cigarette smoking. So 37% of 10th grade adolescents in the US report a history of vaping. They looked at almost 4,000 high school students, and those who were vaping, that predicted a risk of future smoking 6 months ahead, 2.5 times greater, an odds ratio of 2.5 compared with those who weren't vaping. So that seems to point to a fairly strong relationship between nicotine exposure, however innocent, and later tobacco use. And I'm sure that the tobacco companies have this sort of relationship in mind in building their stock of e-cigarette manufacturers and devices and flavours, ways of making it attractive. And in kids at least, although in adults it may be different, vaping was not associated with smoking cessation. So I think this is very telling information, and I think Australia's been wise to maintain a very cautious approach, although as I understand it, nicotine is being reviewed for rescheduling. I'm not sure where it'll be rescheduled, but currently it's a poison, so although you can import it for personal use, you can't sell it or buy it in Queensland. Just another quote of The Emperor's New Clothes. This is an MEP. There won't be many of them in England soon, but there are at the moment. Likening the war on drugs to the Emperor's New Clothes, we keep saying war on drugs year in, year out. It achieves nothing. Now, we're switching over to alcohol here, and this was, you don't often see Samuel Beckett quoted in medical literature. Wernicke-Korsakoff's Waiting for Godot. So this is just a small letter, but it highlights that WKS is poorly understood, poorly recognised, poorly diagnosed and poorly treated. So they write this piece about 10 patients they found lingering in various wards with a mixture of diagnoses including psychotic depression, catatonia, schizophrenia, bipolar, akathisia, autoimmune encephalitis, temporal lobe epilepsy, trauma, syndrome of inappropriate ADH, and hypoglycemia. Those were the lists of diagnoses in the patients, all of whom had developing Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome. The diagnosis took, on average, 22 days to reach in these 10 patients, from 2 to 44 days. And 3 of the patients they found on the wards had also been grossly undertreated with thiamine. So the docs knew what the patient had, but they weren't treating it adequately. So broadly we say if you've got a strong suspicion or established WKS presenting, then you need to give them at least 500 milligrams of thiamine 3 times a day. And certainly anecdotes from Benny's experience at Prince Charles, where there have been a few patients lingering, is that even when there are established changes to the mental state, by aggressive treatment there does seem to be some room for improvement. So saying, oh, it's too late is not helpful. The harms from high dose thiamine replacement are almost zero. There's a very, very low risk of adverse response to the injection. So really anyone in whom WKS is suspected, and the majority are going to be drinkers, but other people with a nutritional problem or with gastric surgery, etc., may also be at risk. It's very important to bear this diagnosis in mind to prevent the really crippling consequences of thiamine deficiency not being recognised. Someone in the BMJ being fairly provocative, junk evaluation by the European Medicines Agency of nalmefene, which is a Me Too drug. It's like naltrexone. When they ran their trials, they were looking at drinkers reducing their consumption rather than an abstinence focus, which is how naltrexone is licensed in Australia at least. So he was talking about this study in that comment commentary, the risks and benefits of nalmefene in the treatment of adult alcohol dependence, a systematic review and meta-analysis. And I love this quotation: if you torture the data for long enough, it will confess. So that's why it's so important when you're planning research, which I don't confess to do very often anymore, that you set your outcome measures beforehand and you try and plan how you're going to manage your data and what you're going to try and show to prove the null hypothesis or disprove the null hypothesis. Because if you collect all your data and then say, right, what would we like to try and show, you can twist and turn and achieve all sorts of results. And someone recently reviewed the papers received by the big journals and looked at how many deviations from the pre-published protocol, which is one way to try and keep researchers honest. So they submit their protocols to the requisite body, and then they subsequently publish their data showing that the two match up. In many, many cases, there were differences that could not be reconciled other than by people data mining or post hoc analysis, as it's called. So it's a great way to make findings that are spurious, in other words. And really the case is that the nalmefene data is really quite spurious. So here are some forest plots, and anything that overlaps with the line here, the solid line, suggests that the changes it's documenting are not significant. So as you can see, all these collected things, apart from one different modelling system, the fixed effects model, show that there's no benefit in mortality, physical well-being or mental well-being from patients on nalmefene compared with those on the placebo. Now, why didn't the company choose to match their product against naltrexone? Well, we know why, because they wouldn't have shown any benefit. So what's extraordinary is how this product has become accepted for control of heavy drinking. So patients are receiving a subsidised medicine so they can go out on a Saturday night and maybe drink 2 or 3 less jars than they would have done otherwise. The actual difference, although statistically significant, I think clinically is nowhere relevant at all. We're talking about someone reducing from 19 to 16 drinks on a big night. So I think the way this has got round the regulatory authorities is really rather intriguing, and I think some of the authors of the studies had significant financial interests in the success. So really the data don't show any significant benefit, and they didn't do any head-to-head trials with established treatments. There were many more dropouts from the nalmefene group than from the placebo group. So all sorts of problems with this, yet they still got the product up, which is rather worrying. Just one final thing, and I have a very poor understanding of Twitter and Instagram, and I'm very happy to leave it that way. Thank you very much. But what we see here is this group asked themselves whether if they invented personas as 13-year-olds, 15-year-olds, 17-year-olds, 19-year-olds, one male, one female, and went on Twitter and Instagram and expressed an interest in alcohol products, what would happen? And amazingly, they were bombarded with information. So particularly towards the end of the week. So on Thursday, it really ramped up for Friday, Saturday, Sunday. Over 21s, okay, so that it's legal for them to drink. This came from the States. They had 1,836 tweets over 30 days relating to alcohol. And the group overall had 362 Instagrams over 30 days promoting alcohol. So this is the way the companies are now using social media to promote their products. And it's things like, how do you make this drink palatable by mixing it with so-and-so? What's your recipe for this and that? And showing photographs of products and circulating them in that way. So a lot of this is obviously driven by big alcohol, and it's getting to its market or its potential market in ways that really are far from those intended. Now, Barbara Sinclair graduated from Mount Isa Hospital, where she was an advanced trainee in psychiatry many years ago. So I know her, so I was taken a bit with this paper, which comes from New South Wales. And they have a trial of involuntary treatment. So they've written this up. They got Robin Murray from the Maudsley, so it's a pretty heavy-hitting set of authors. Glenys Dorr, who came to WOWS 3 years ago or so, they talked about 40 patients who had severe alcohol use disorder, and as they've kind of defined it down the bottom, they were gravely disabled, and I think grave is a bit of a pun there because near death, gravely disabled by their alcohol use disorder. So lots of brain injury, lots of mental health problems coexisting as you'd expect. They'd tried all sorts of other less restrictive interventions, and then they were following people up. I think it was a 12-month follow-up. So 4 of the 40, 10% died, 11 had relapsed, so that's 25-30% of relapse. 5 were lost to follow-up, 13 were abstinent, and 7 were drinking less. So they asked the question at the end, is the right to freedom to go and drink yourself to death, is that someone who's going to die with their rights on, or are we denying them the autonomy to create a better life for themselves by restricting their liberty for a while in order for them to come to their senses and maybe drink less or stop?
Jeremy, can I make a comment?
Yes.
What I heard about this, that they have a much more comprehensive and extensive treatment program than what someone who just walks in from the street. So I think there's no surprise that they would have a much better outcome. So
I mean, the outcome is better. It's not brilliant, though, is it? I mean, 50% roughly are, and those who are lost to follow-up, they're presumably still drinking because they're not attending. So half the group have either died, continued drinking, or lost to follow-up. So maybe half is better than a third or a quarter, which we might more realistically expect. Thanks, Nicola. Okay, we're moving on to methproject.org, and I was amazed this website is still extant. And in a moment, Ben, through the magic of technology, is going to show you a short snippet from it. So this is a rather scary photo, isn't it? And, you know, who wants to look like that, and all those ribs hanging out, etc. So the reason I'm showing this is because I would argue this is an excellent example of the emperor having no clothes, because this was a program that was dreamt up and rolled out without any proper evaluation. More than $1.5 billion was spent on Meth Project advertising. Yet, as we'll see in a couple of slides, there's no evidence from independent evaluations. They weren't evaluating it, they just felt pleased with themselves and thought this has got to be good, we'll shock people into submission. You know, they'll come begging for relief from these adverts because they're so awful. This is an example, I think, of how not to do public health promotion and policy. So here's one of the slides if you go onto the website, and there's about 6 or 8 different menu options, and then at the very bottom is if you've got a friend you want to help or something. So there's no sense that this is something that you can recover from. This is all the terrible things that are going to happen to you. No sense of life after meth, which of course there is life after meth. This is just about a 30-second clip, and listen to the sound effects. They're rather nauseating.
Oh.
So I was just saying this is a dentist's delight, this little snip. I don't know how much influence it had on those using meth, or those planning to use meth. Are they really going to scroll through this sort of nonsense and be, oh my God, I'd protect my teeth, I'm not going to try it. Everyone thinks it won't happen to them, don't they? So scaring people is nonsense. Now this gives me another example to raise an Emperor's New Clothes moment. I just took this from the website, so there is a little bit about find help, but it's scarcely the first thing they talk about. The first thing they talk about is all the dreadful things that are going to happen to you. So there was a coalition flagship, the coalition government, Conservative and Liberals is slightly different in the UK from here, but you know, the same sort of end of the spectrum perhaps. it's just been evaluated. It was developed after serious riots across many inner cities in the UK in 2011, which presumably had the same sort of origins as we know riots in many parts of the developed world have. It's kind of the haves against the have-nots, or the have-nots against the haves, perhaps. So they developed this high-profile intervention program targeting troubled families. And what they found after 4 years was there was no benefit at all. This was predicted at the time and confirmed at the 4-year evaluation. They had no pilot or initial evaluation. They just rolled out this dreamt-up scheme which ignored evidence-based approaches already established. And so it shows that just because you fund something to try and achieve an end result, it doesn't necessarily mean those end results will be achieved. It's more complicated than that. And if you simply target narrowly what you perceive as a few troubled families in the community and expect everything to come good, so a narrow approach to broad and complex problems won't deliver meaningful results. So the UK Troubled Families Programme, an excellent example of the Emperor's new clothes. You know, the Pollies were wandering around showing off their wonderful new clothes, and really they were naked before us. So this is taking off the meth project. I really like the next slide as well. So you can see a bit of tooth flying out there. I think that's just a magical moment. And of course, this is how to turn your meth user around. Humour. That's how we need to approach these things. Okay, so does information matter? The effect of the meth project on meth use amongst youths. And this is back to 2010, but I still think it applies. So what the Montana folk showed was a dramatic fall in meth use. So their success was evident. Unfortunately, it was a fall in meth use that was reproduced across other states nearby, like North Dakota and Wyoming, which from my knowledge of geography, they're sort of big rural states as well, like Montana. And so it was very hard to demonstrate any positive results from this intervention, even though it gained so much traction that other states started using it. The evidence from the evaluation is no effect, null. So my question, do scary adverts work? Well, do we really benefit from demonising users? Someone on ground floor said her son saw one of the adverts that the federal government in its wisdom put up about a huge contingent of security officers trying to hold down a young man under the influence of amphetamine, and the 12-year-old said, wow, I want some of that. He wanted to be like the Incredible Hulk, you know? So there's unintended consequences of these scary adverts. It creates the perception that ice use is widespread. So I went to talk to a council up Pine Rivers Way, and there was a councillor present, and his perception of ice use was 20% of the population. So 10 times the measured amount of people who'd used at least once in the last year. He thought it was 20%. It doesn't highlight the treatment outcomes and options, a life after using, harm reduction, NSPs, plain packaging legislation. So, of course, history shows we're condemned to repeat the errors of history. Usually it's retired policemen who come up with the idea that the war on drugs is pointless. This was Jim Duffy while he was an inspector. Drug addicts should be given access to substances that do exactly what they say on the tin. And many other proponents of decriminalisation have made the same point. So again, very small graphs, I'm sorry, but I will help you through. So this is a study of what has been happening in the opioid field in Australia in the last 25 years. So we start in 1990. And what surprised me a bit was that codeine, defined daily doses of codeine, which is lower morphine equivalent than morphine daily dose, so there's some disparity there. However, codeine forms 41% of prescribed opioids over this time. And then we have others, such as fentanyl going up, and you can see that in 2006, fentanyl was no longer restricted to palliative care for cancer patients. It could be used for chronic pain. So a massive explosion in fentanyl shows how prescribing restrictions can be helpful, releasing restrictions may be less helpful. We can see oxycodone, the rise here, and this is putting all the opioids together. And morphine has a bit of a look, but it's certainly by no means as popular as the oxycodone. So those graphs don't show up very well, I realise. Abuse-deterrent opioids, this is from Medscape, and it just highlights some of the products. What really alarms us is that 50% of prescribers think that abuse-deterrent opioids are less addictive. How many people in this room think that's true? Fantastic.
So it's marketed.
Yeah, exactly. So it's just like the white cigarettes, you know, Royal Whites or something, you know, they're going to be safer than Royal Blacks. It's pernicious. It's, as we know, some of these supposed abuse deterrent products are pretty easy to break. Those mixed with naltrexone, I haven't heard of anyone successfully combating that combination. But certainly the pills and various forms in which things can be produced, they seem to have ways around them on the internet, etc. I guess we should be a little bit worried, although this was a pretty soft study, I have to say. They just looked back at their patients coming into treatment, and they did a weight and BMI at the start, and then 6 to 12 months later. And they showed that the mean body mass index went from 27 to 30. There we are, 18 months in treatment. So we kind of think of people coming into treatment potentially as being very underweight because they've been undernourished. So that may be part of the explanation for this. However, their means are certainly above the healthy weights, and it was a significant increase. It was only about, less than 100 patients. So perhaps with our large numbers in Metro North or more widely, we could put together a better series and work out what's happened. And I've always kind of thought that some people gain weight, some people lose weight on methadone. They suggest that methadone may increase the desire for sweet foods, promote hypoglycemia, and cause insulin resistance. So that's their discussion. Now this again is a retrospective, quite a small paper, small numbers. I think though it's quite interesting. They looked at patients, many of whom had a pain background, using prescription opioids, a mean of 3 years, coming into treatment. And they calculated the oral morphine equivalent. So that's how we produce a sort of level playing field amongst the different opioids. And anyone who wants to download the app from the pain medicine faculty, it's a really good app. It won an award, and it gives you very good numbers very quickly. So when you plugged in what patients reported using into the app, the methadone patients using on average about 700, and the bupe patients a little bit more. After 28 days, so stabilized on opioid treatment, the average dose was 60 milligrams of methadone or 18 milligrams of buprenorphine, and patients were stable at that stage. So I think sometimes we tend to say, oh gosh, this person's using so much morphine, we'll never be able to control them with Suboxone, their pain's just too bad. That really throws that idea under some suspicion, I think. So that's another bit of clothing that we should see through, I reckon. Of course, they say beware conversion tables overall because they can be very misleading. And of course, as we do, we titrate according to individual needs. Now, maybe some of these totals were overstated. They did their best to try and work that out. By any token, 700 milligrams of morphine is a very high dose, or morphine equivalent. Yet the doses of methadone and bupe that they landed up on were well within the kind of acceptable range, I think we'd agree. Now, I must confess I don't fully understand this paper, but I read the abstract and took the conclusions and struggled through all their very complicated graphs and things. So the title kind of gives the message: morphine paradoxically prolongs neuropathic pain in rats. I won't read the second half, you can read it. So they talk about opioid-induced hyperalgesia being a poorly understood phenomenon, though I think very relevant for people on high doses. They used laboratory rats, poor creatures, and they developed a two-hit model of neuropathic pain. So they put a suture around the sciatic nerve of the rat so that it wouldn't behave normally. It was under pressure. And that's very painful, I can imagine. And then 10 days later, they gave half the rats morphine and half not. And what they showed is that the rats receiving the morphine had more longer pain, which they can measure from various unpleasant ways of interacting with rats. So their conclusion is that morphine in this sort of situation can produce chronic pain rather than relieve it. So it's really rather alarming. This was Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, so that's a pretty august journal in the States. And some of this comes from South Australia. I think Peter Grace is working in Adelaide and has published some other work on some of these neurotransmitters now at the spinal cord level, which are recognised in continuing inflammation, which seems to be a large part of what causes persistent pain. It's a bit ironic if we're making things worse by our intervention. And that's what this slide's about, really. Who gets high-dose opioid therapy for chronic non-cancer pain? Well, it's really a process of adverse selection. Unlike Charles Darwin, his natural selection, the fittest going forwards, this is the least fit going forward. Often they've got multiple pain problems, medical and psychiatric problems. They're using tobacco, which makes that much worse, and other substances. They won't be included in trials because they're too messy. What we land up with is the most distressed patients are those in whom the clinicians find the greatest drive to give relief. So the least appropriate patients where it's most likely to go wrong are the ones who end up getting the high-dose opioids. So really we should turn this around and look at other ways to support, maximise help, minimise harm to the most vulnerable group who are being selected at present. So I put this to the pain, a pain meeting that I spoke at a few months ago. I was trying to stir them up, as one wants to do. If a long-term treatment for a patient with persistent pain does not have a good evidence base, increases their chance of death, reduces their chance of return to work after injury by 50%, doubles their likelihood of being on a disability pension at 1 year, and these are all studies where they have matched controls. So it's not just the ones with the opioids had worse injuries, they matched them with non-opioid patients. So double your chances of being on disability pension, and in the highest doses of opioids, their chances of being on DSP went up by more than tenfold compared with those control patients on no opioids. Gave them a 25% risk of becoming drug dependent or having an opioid use disorder, so it's gone on from a pain problem to a real addiction issue. Showed worse scores on pain, quality of life and functional measures compared with controls. And as we saw on the previous slide, is given to the most least suitable patients. Should you be prescribing it, pain doctors? Should we be using opioids to treat distress and suffering? I'll leave those questions open.
Jeremy, how do you prevent being stoned?
Now, I was very struck by this paper. John Strang, he's at the Maudsley, naloxone without the needle. So we all know take-home naloxone is a big movement. We know that in the States there is now a licensed product for intranasal administration. The way he tackled this was he looked at what came out, I think, as 112 routes of administration to the human body. I never imagined 112 routes. And they looked at them all and the evidence for them all. And some of them were interarticular or interventricular, so something we weren't going to do. But there are 112 different routes to introduce drugs into a person. It's fascinating, isn't it? And what they came down on was that either buccal or intranasal was the way to go. So that'll save you reading the paper. And this is the new product in the States. I found this on a website. The first and only FDA-approved nasal naloxone. And here it is. And it's rather a nice picture, isn't it? Because this is the Venturi effect. You create an aerosol when you force a solution through a narrow orifice. It needs to be the right size, and you need to calculate it. And they actually pack 4 milligrams of naloxone in 0.1 mil. So that is 100 times more concentrated than the product we use, which is 400 micrograms in 1 mil. And that's because the nasal route is less effective at uptake. However, if you give more, it gets through. So I would think you would all agree with me that stuffing this little device into someone's nostril and pushing away firmly seems much to be preferred from all the flaff of drawing up and pricking yourself and getting hep C and all the rest of your troubles. Now, here are the two examples of new uses for buprenorphine. Samidorphan, it sounds made up, but it's real. It's a naloxone-like drug, so it blocks the mu opioid receptor. As you know, there are 4 opioid receptors, deltas and nociceptin. So we're talking about 2 here. We're talking about mu opioid and kappa opioid. And I actually changed this slide because I couldn't, and I still don't really know, decide whether buprenorphine is a partial agonist, in other words, it has some effect at the receptor, or whether you call it a partial antagonist, because it also blocks the receptor. And in a sense, it's both. And we're familiar with that from the mu activity of bup, aren't we? We know that if you've got someone with a heroin overdose to whom you give, say, Suboxone or even simple buprenorphine, you can bring them round. On the other hand, if you take enough buprenorphine, I guess, with benzos and alcohol, you can certainly reverse some of the buprenorphine effects in that mixed drug overdose by means of naloxone. So it's both an agonist and an antagonist. Anyway, so I think it depends which side of the coin you want to look at, but what they're really doing with this product is eliminating mu, supposedly, from the equation and just using kappa. Now we should reflect that other kappa agonists include ketamine. Now that's got a bit of history in treating resistant depression. There's a certain practitioner on the north side who has more than 700 patients on ketamine. Regular visits for oral ketamine they are given. Pentazocine, which is another opioid we don't see much of in this country. Salvia, which is a plant product. Ibogaine, which has gained a reputation for being a cure-all for substance use disorders. Even morphine has a kappa agonist effect. The 2 antagonists listed here are naloxone and naltrexone. So I don't know which it's more accurate to put buprenorphine in. In a sense, it's a kappa agent with a low intrinsic activity, so that's how much it opens the door. When for a mu receptor, methadone opens the door wide open, buprenorphine only partly opens that door. It also has high binding, so it will displace other kappa agonists. Anyway, so they decided to do a trial of this study. I first heard about this medication from a patient who's a bit of a psychonaut, and he's got a psychiatrist, and he's now on 2 milligrams of Suboxone. He became opioid dependent with the poppy seed, making tea, a kilo a day, and he sort of ran out of poppy seed supplies, so he came into treatment. And 2 years on, he's still on a low dose of buprenorphine, and effectively he's waiting for this product, Samidorphan, to be licensed so he can go on to that to treat his mood disorder, because he's so persuaded that it is opioid responsive. So this study, fairly small numbers, and because of worries about the placebo effect in treating depression, where, in other words, quite a high number, up to 40% of patients respond to a little orange or yellow or red tablet, depends on the colour, what level of response you get, so that's how placebo works. They took the ones who had not responded at 4 weeks when they had a placebo group and an active treatment group, and put those patients into active treatment and looked at them again at 8 weeks, so stage 1 and stage 2. Just to note that Dr. Faver, who's the first author, has consulted with many different companies, and indeed this is only half of them. There's another column on the next page. It's astonishing. So HAM-D, that's the Hamilton Depression Index. So that's a fairly well-used tool around the place. And this is another depression measuring score. And as you know, psychologists have millions of ways of measuring things. And you know, if one doesn't work, you try another one, and that might show it. That's why you have to set your tools before you do your research, rather than use millions of tools and then see which one worked at the end, because you can see how the result can be influenced. So what we can see here is this is the 2 milligrams bup, 2 milligrams Samidorphan in blue, and here we have the red, which was the 8s, and it's clear that at 2 weeks blue seems to be doing better, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, and even in stage 2, it looks like if anything is having an effect, it's the blue that's better, so the 2 milligram dose. Now, one of the reasons for this is that there were more dropouts in the 8 milligram dose, so people were getting nausea and dizzy. So that kind of raises the question, how good a mu opioid blocker is samidorphan if people are getting those initial opioid effects, dizziness and nausea. Maybe samidorphan isn't doing quite as good job as we might hope. And the results for the MADRS aren't quite as persuasive, but certainly here at the end, it's the 2 milligram dose that looks better. Now, there are several studies. There's a press release because this is a company that's organising them, and they're looking at smaller doses than 2, so they've got a 1 milligram study. They did a bigger 8 milligram study which showed no difference. So this is really a work in progress, and it's an example of how drug design is increasingly commercialised, and trials are influencing the share price of the company responsible. And unfortunately, I think it's bound to cloud how results are presented and received. So they present this as really great. When I asked Professor Stahl about this a couple of weeks ago, he said, "Oh, well, you know, the US has got a real problem with opioids at the moment, and this is one more way of spreading opioids around the place," and that's perhaps quite a good point. This is perhaps even more interesting as a study. The use of ultra-low dose, so 0.2 to 0.8 with their doses of bupe, as a time-limited treatment for severe suicidal ideation, an RCT. So they ended up with, they put twice as many in the treatment group as the placebo arm. Many of them had borderline personality. The others had major depressive illness. And most were on antidepressants, and about a third were on benzos. Here's the mean dose of bupe, and there was a significant dropout. And again, there's a patent application for this use of buprenorphine as an antidepressant. So we have to kind of be mindful of that. And here we have the mean score change in suicidal ideation on the Beck scale. So what you can see with the placebo group is there's an initial drop, and then after 4 weeks it's just below baseline, whereas there does seem to be a very significant drop in the buprenorphine group. And there's just some more graphs showing us that all these patients were already on antidepressants. No, these patients, 70% were on antidepressants. Sorry, the other group, they were all on antidepressants already, so it was an add-in. I'm sorry, I should have said that. So patients who use and did not use standard antidepressants, here the biggest effects are the buprenorphine without the antidepressant, which actually seems a bit better than the buprenorphine with antidepressant, doesn't it? So really remarkable that treating pain, maybe spiritual pain, maybe the suffering of life in someone with borderline, seems to be more effective than using conventional antidepressants, or at least as effective as for suicidality. And I won't go into that because I'm a bit short of time. So since this article by Wayne Hall and the Trumpishness that's around, we now have 8 states which permit recreational cannabis in the US. In June, when this paper was published, it was 4. Oh, sorry, what am I saying? Recreational. Oh, yes, they all already have medicinal cannabis. So this is recreational cannabis on the background of medicinal, which started, I think, in Alaska in about 96. So for some states, it's taken as much as 20 years to go from medicinal to recreational. One of their comments, their quotes, "There's no reason why a joint should be any more expensive than a tea bag." Oh. Which certainly gets the imagination going, doesn't it? They say the price is like to fall. Legal production is cheaper than the black market. If you tax it according to the grams, and that's the way to get states hooked on recreational marijuana, is if you start taxing the product and they get a really good income stream from it, then they're going to be very reluctant to say, okay, we've gone too far, we want to step back. And we know how sensitive alcohol and tobacco are. If you tax per gram of weed, which is what they do at the moment, that's going to boost the people preparing high THC levels in their product. So you're getting more bang for your buck. So there are some major inherent dangers in all this. And we know that big cannabis has really stepped up to the plate in the US, and there are retail outlets and competition, and it's all very difficult, particularly since at a federal level it's no longer permitted. I should say that California, I think they were one of the first states, I think it was 1996, to allow medicinal cannabis. They have just gone with recreational, and California itself is the 6th largest economy in the world. So, I think what they do in the US, although we may see the isolationism of Trump, is probably going to spread further around the world, as indeed it has already done so in the case of marijuana. What about Queensland? You may be aware there's going to be a patient class prescriber fitting into one of those specialised groups, so palliative, oncology, the vomiting from chemo, the neurology, if that's for the seizures, palliatives for general pain of life, and the single patient prescriber, so that's another prescriber making an application on behalf of a single patient. It's not to be used as a first line, so this is a sort of third line, and in your application you will have to justify why you're making this choice, and the aim is for it not to be a smokable product, but just see how long that lasts. A set of agreed indications which are under development, the patient has to pay. Nabiximol, which is about the only product that's been used to any degree in Australia, costs about $1,500 per month. In Victoria, I learned from Ian Freckleton, the barrister and cannabis commissioner, who spoke at QUT on Monday, they're actually going to grow their own. So the Premier of Victoria was pictured with his cannabis crops, various strains, and they're going to produce it, so the state will produce it. So perfect for taxing, isn't it? Perfect. And I think that'll probably be the way forward. Now, having satisfied Queensland legislation, you also need TGA approval to prescribe medicinal cannabis under the current system. So it's very cumbersome. I asked Ian Freckleton what would be the likely outcome for persistent pain patients. He showed data from North America that 90% of patients on medicinal cannabis are young men with persistent pain now, And he said, well, that's a very good question. He said, well, what we'll probably suggest is that you need two specialists to agree with each other about an individual patient that their persistent pain is such, and their medication history is such, and their drug use history is such that they can safely be prescribed medicinal marijuana. Now, that's sort of creating artificial barriers. We've agreed the evidence base is really quite poor, and I must say the evidence base for persistent pain is no worse than any other indication, really, according to quite good reviews. So, I think we're still in a state of some confusion here about where we're heading. This is just John Strang again talking about the synthetic cannabinoids showing 50 to 300 times a greater affinity for CB1, which is where you get the psychoactives. They are full agonists, whereas THC is a partial agonist. I didn't know that till I read this. So they give more bang for your buck at the receptor, and they also work at the CB2 receptor, which is widely distributed through the body, which explains some of the other adverse effects, tachycardia, collapse, seizures, and so forth. And it has downstream effects on serotonin 2A receptors and so forth. So spice is not all things nice at all. Now, in this month's Internal Medicine Journal, we've got a piece on alcohol use disorders, on medicinal cannabis, and on pill testing at conference. In last week's BMJ, we had 3 articles and a letter about drug policy, the war on drugs, how useless it is, how we should be not locking up non-violent drug offenders, users, and the rest. So I don't know whether that means there's a kind of sea change there. I haven't got time to go through that. Public health and international drug policy. So this is the global report on drugs, and it points out that imprisonments for drug possession and drug trafficking is the only area of increased business for prisons these days. Around the world, 21% of people locked up are locked up for drug offences. In Thailand, that number is 68%. Only 8 countries around the world have prison needle syringe programs. fascinating. In Germany, they thought they'd save some money by closing their NSP, and the custody staff said, no, you mustn't. It's necessary. We need it. It protects us. In the ACT, they had a vote amongst the custodial staff, and there was 1 in favour and 143 against, or something. So isn't it amazing how opinions can be so different around the world? Just the futility of crop eradication measures. So it was estimated that Colombia being saturated with glyphosate cost $240,000 per kilo of cocaine they prevented entering the country, and in Afghanistan $44,000 per hectare of poppies that were protected from coming to fruit. So I think I'm running over now. Anyway, Portugal, we know, is a shining star for decriminalisation. Their HIV cases have reduced by 8-fold. No change in cannabis use rate, and it's still low compared with the rest of Europe. Bolivia has now argued successfully to return to cultivation of coca leaves for prevention of altitude sickness in their farmers, in spite of the UN Convention on Narcotics. So fascinating developments around the world. They have a series of recommendations here, which all make very good sense. So our conclusions, public health perspectives are very good to have in mind in our work. Think of NSPs, the harm they've saved, plain packaging legislation. Growing moves to see alcohol and drug services as a health, or alcohol and drug issues as a health problem, not a law enforcement problem. Multiple randomized controlled trials, they provide the fine cloth, the evidence for all to see. Politicians and emperors, however, may still proceed with their new clothes regardless. And ineffective or harmful public policy should be enough to produce a change in direction. So if you were expecting some tips on fashion this morning, I'm afraid I'm not well placed, but Charlie is sitting in the back and she'd be happy to talk with you. Thanks very much.
Jeremy, in the American Prohibition era with Al Capone used to spend a sizable portion of his income bribing politicians and judges to prevent the legalisation of alcohol. Do you think that hasn't happened with cannabis is because there's no great monolithic organisation behind the manufacture of marijuana? It's more cottage industries, or?
I think in this country that's very true. It's a lot of grow your own and stuff, isn't it? I think in the US, though, there's growing interest from big business, so they will form another lobby group. And I think it's fair to say the horse has bolted. There is no way to get it back in the stable in the US. And I mean, Ian Freckleton, who did a lot of research for his Victorian Law Commission report on cannabis and the problems that legalisation might bring, he really did reflect very seriously on the harms and the problems that have arisen in the States as a result of their kind of open door policy developing. I think that we've seen perhaps 20 years from when medicinal became accepted to recreational. I think the next change with globalisation, even in Australia, will be much sooner than that, personally, I think.
Any data showing any difference between the harm caused by legalization or compared with criminalization?
Well, I think Portugal is the sort of standout example. We also know Ecuador has gone in the opposite direction of the UN conventions. So Portugal, although it's still heavily contended by the abstinence guys and the liberalisation guys, they've really changed it from a criminal activity to a health activity. So it's not that they're ignoring it or turning a blind eye. If you are found with enough for personal use only, you get referred to a kind of health commission which is set up in your local area, and they kind of wag the finger and offer you treatment options. So it's not completely open slather by any means. It's decriminalisation, it's not legalisation. There's stages along the way, because with legalisation you get advertising and promotion and all the involvement of big business and the harms that can result from that. So there's a very nice curve which shows harms in a U shape between absolute prohibition, where you get all this underground black market injection in corners and all bloodborne viruses, shared equipment, all that stuff, and total liberalisation, where you get the whole population being encouraged to use everything every day. And in the middle is maybe the sweet spot where you get the minimum of harms from that balance between some control and regulation, but not promotion. And that's where decolonization stands.